On this World Press Freedom Day, Africa 54 takes a closer look at the challenges facing journalists on the continent. We'll also examine the connection between drought, famine, migration, and politics. And sportswear giant Nike sparks controversy after tapping into a small but growing market. Africa 54 starts right now.
Good evening, I'm Esther Gidhu. You are in for Vincent Makori. This is Africa 54. May 3rd is World Press Freedom Day, a day to celebrate the fundamental principles of press freedom around the world and to defend the media from attacks, as well as pay tribute to journalists who have lost their lives in the line of duty. International Day was proclaimed by the United Nations in 1993 following a recommendation adopted at the United Nations Education, Scientific and Cultural Organization General Conference in 1991. UNESCO leads the worldwide celebration by identifying the global theme and organizing the main event in different parts of the world each year. Now, World Press Freedom is in decline. That is the assessment of a rights group, Freedom House, which has just released its annual Freedom of the Press report. Africa 54's Heidi Adams-Fitzpatrick looks at what the findings mean for Africa.
The study is a snapshot of the global media environment. It measures the diversity of news and information and ability of newspapers, radio stations, TV channels and internet sites to operate without the threat of retaliation. Jennifer Dunham led the research team.
It's important that all citizens have free access to information, and that also that there's a free press operating that can hold governments to account and that can also report to citizens and to the larger world about the events that are going on in their countries.
The report rates countries on a scale of 1 to 100. The higher the score, the worse the situation. How does Africa measure up? Dunham says it's a mixed bag of good and bad.
Ethiopia is a prime example where a bad situation got worse last year because of the state of emergency and the protests. I think that codified what was already going on in practice.
Ethiopian authorities banned the public from reading information from people who had been exiled, the report says. Officials continued to arrest and detain journalists for their coverage of anti-government protests. In South Africa, long considered one of the freest free speech countries on the continent, President Jacob Zuma has been accused of politicizing the leadership of the state broadcaster and limiting coverage of violent pre-election protests. South Sudan had the biggest decline in media freedom. The DRC, Burundi and Zimbabwe remain among the worst places for journalists to work. Eritrea and Equatorial Guinea also make the list of the top 10 worst performing countries in the world. But there's good news. Africa overall scores higher than places like Eurasia and the Middle East, which are considered the world's worst regions for press freedom. Dunham says Africa's media landscape is volatile but not dire.
We see countries like Uganda or Kenya or South Africa where the media space is very contested, but there's also a very vibrant media community. There's a lot of really good, aggressive reporting and a lot of press freedom advocacy groups who are doing a good job. We've also seen improvements in recent years in West Africa. West African countries are actually making an effort, as a lot of them recover from conflicts from several years ago, to implement laws and policies that are very positive.
Media freedom can often affect political outcomes. Dunham says it's during elections that the battle over ideas requires a robust, open debate.
We see a lot of countries or governments doing less outright rigging of elections and more manipulating the media environment months or even years before the election, taking over private media outlets and having their friends own them and change the editorial tone, or even not giving space on the public broadcaster to opposition candidates. So it's kind of, the whole system is rigged, so they don't have to do violence or ballot rigging on the day of the election.
Dunham says Africans are becoming a lot more savvy in the way they receive and distribute their news. thanks to cell phones and social media, putting more power in the hands of the public to shape their media environment. Hayley Adams Fitzpatrick, VOA News, Washington.
Public, private and federally funded media outlets say journalism faces many challenges, including fake news. To mark World Press Freedom Day, the Broadcasting Board of Governors, a U.S. federal agency, and George Washington University School of Media and Public Affairs held a forum on the importance of U.S. international journalists defending press freedom and journalist safety. VOA's Mariama Diallo reports.
Panelists discussed the public's growing hunger for accurate information and the efforts of some governments to limit access to it.
They run the gamut from truly despotic places to places we might even have looked at as democracies, where controlling the flow of information has become a principal tool of their government. And it's made it extremely difficult and in some cases extremely dangerous to gather news.
Increasingly, there is what the head of the Broadcasting Board of Governors, John Lansing, referred to as a weaponization of information.
You look at what's happening coming out of the Kremlin, and it's really almost beyond a false narrative. It's more of a strategy to establish that there's really no such thing as an empirical fact. Facts are really what are being challenged around the world by these regimes, and you see that now happening in Turkey as well.
Last week, Reporters Without Borders released its 2017 World Press Freedom Index. Russia came in at 148 out of the 180 countries. The group says since 2012, leading independent news outlets have either been brought under government control or throttled out of existence. Turkey fell 4 places to 155 in the same index. According to Freedom House, a pro-democracy advocacy group, press freedom globally declined to its lowest levels in 13 years. One reason, new threats to journalists and media outlets in major democracies.
Not only is it more difficult for us to bring, the world to America, it's becoming increasingly more difficult to bring America to the world because of the climate that we have here. It's not just about law and danger, it's about respect for the press.
I happen to know how dishonest the media is.
President Donald Trump has called the media an enemy of the American people and accused some U.S. media outlets of spreading fake news. Reporters Without Borders has said Trump's media bashing is emboldening other world leaders to mistreat their own media. In response to questions about whether the Voice of America can remain neutral, not become a voice of the Trump administration, Lansing said people need to understand the VOA charter makes it illegal for that to happen. Mariama Diallo, VOA News, Washington.
A media rights watchdog group is warning that over the past year, global press freedom has, in its words, never been so threatened. VOA's William Gallo reports.
The worst offenders? The usual suspects. North Korea, led by authoritarian leader Kim Jong-un. Syria, in the middle of a 6-year civil war. And China, where the Communist Party controls all domestic media. But what's changing is democracies, such as the U.S., are also seeing a decline in press freedom, says Jennifer Dunham with Freedom House.
One of the biggest trends we saw were declines in democracies, and this is one of the most disturbing trends that we saw.
Specifically, U.S. President Donald Trump's attacks on individual journalists and media outlets. But despite those concerns, Freedom House says the U.S. institution of free speech remains strong.
Right now, we're very concerned about the U.S., but we haven't seen any kind of dramatic decline.
Perhaps of greater concern is that Trump's media bashing is emboldening other authoritarian leaders to act similarly, warns Reporters Without Borders.
This hate speech contributed to disinhibit attacks on the media almost everywhere in the world, including in democratic countries.
According to Reporters Without Borders, the U.S. fell 2 spots in this year's Press Freedom Index. Bill Gallo, VOA News, Washington.
At least 8 civilians were killed and 27 others were wounded Wednesday after a suicide bomber struck a foreign forces military convoy in a diplomatic district in central Kabul. The blast occurred at an area next to NATO-led Resolute Support headquarters. Among the injured people were 3 NATO-led Resolute Support Service members who suffered non-life-threatening wounds. Several of the injured remain in critical condition. 3 cars, including 1 armored military vehicle, were destroyed, and several cars and buildings around the site were damaged by the explosion in the area where the U.S. Embassy and Supreme Court office are located. A local affiliate of the Islamic State group has claimed responsibility for the blast. We want to know what you think about Africa 54 and the stories we cover. Join the conversation on Facebook. The address is Africa 54. We're also streaming our show live on Facebook, so check us out and share our show with your friends. Also, check out our headlines 24/7 on voaafrica.com. Coming up, overcoming the perils of famine, drought, and migration. Stay with us.
I'm Bill Arcega. I'm the host of VOA's The Correspondents, a roundup of the world's top stories with analysis from our dedicated reporters. It's really a conversation the same way that you would bring a friend to your home and ask them what's going on. And our correspondents will do that and answer those questions through their own eyes.
That appears a false choice in more ways than one.
We can't actually put you there, but we can come pretty close. In 30 minutes, we'll show you the world.
My name's Carla Babb, and I work the Pentagon Beat. That access helps me to do better stories. Every day, it's my responsibility to collect all of the defense news. It keeps our VOA viewers informed. I get to travel all across the globe. Anything that's defense-related and how to protect and keep people safe, that's where I'll go. So it's never a dull moment at the Pentagon. My name is Carla Babb. This is my beat.
Now, the Horn of Africa is being hard hit by hunger and drought. Thousands of people are continuing to seek refuge in neighboring countries, while others are dying on the high seas of the Mediterranean as they pursue a better life in Europe. I spoke to Professor Abdi Samata of the University of Minnesota via Skype and asked him why a country like Botswana, which is drought-borne, has not experienced hunger or mass migration like the countries in the Horn and East Africa, and what these countries can learn from Botswana.
I think the first thing, Esther, to note is that the problem of famine is not because nature has failed to deliver rain for the population, but it's a political and governance failure on the part of the regimes in the Horn of Africa and East Africa in large measure. So when the rains fail in Botswana, for instance, they immediately put systems into place so that the farmers and the herders are protected from that by buying their stock and then giving them hard cash at good prices so that they can restock when the drought's over. So that's the kind of a system that does not exist in Kenya or exist in Somalia or Ethiopia or in South Sudan.
Now, Professor Samata, we know that these drought seasons are predictable. What is the immediate thing that they can do to at least save people's lives?
I think there are 2 issues here, Esther. One is the long term and the short term. The short term is the immediate stuff. There, in my opinion, rather than international community putting emphasis on the war and terror and all of that stuff, I think the United Nations, the international community, with the leadership of the United States, should make that absolute priority over everything else, getting food and water and medicine into those places. If that means dropping it from the air, that's the way to do it.
Now, Professor, you mentioned the international community. You also mentioned the United States. And indeed, what we see now is the United States and the international community sending food aid to those countries. What are the African countries doing to help their lot? And also, what is the role of the African Union in a crisis like this?
In my opinion, the African Union doesn't have the resources or dignity to be able to stand up tall on this matter. I think if the populations don't put political pressure on Kenyatta, on Mr. Farmajo, on the Prime Minister of Ethiopia and others who are investing heavily in weapons and military machines rather than in resources to enable people to build stock so that when the rainy season fails, they can take care of themselves.
How should the continent respond to the migration problem? Literally thousands of people dying across the Mediterranean trying to reach Europe.
The first priority in every country is job creation, particularly for young people. If Kenya is able to produce 1 million jobs a year for young people, if they are able to do that in the Sudan or in Ethiopia or in Eritrea, much of this will not happen. And again, the case of Botswana is a clear example. Here is a success case who have managed the economy very well and which have therefore enabled its people and its young educated people, rather than leave the country, actually come back to the country and have a decent livelihood with a great deal of dignity in serving their own populations.
Now, in Wednesday's business news, Nigeria continues to grapple with its convoluted exchange rate system, wild swings in the naira, and a shortage of US and euro dollars. The Central Bank of Nigeria has taken steps to add some confidence back in the market. Now, joining us from New York with all the details about the Nigerian market is Jill Malandrino. Jill, how are you today?
Hi, thank you. So Reuters reported that the Central Bank of Nigeria has been working to make the exchange rates for its currency converge on the official and black markets and plans to offer 100 million US on the forward market on Tuesday to boost liquidity. Now, Nigeria runs a system of multiple exchange rates, and the central bank has sold more than $4 billion on the spot and forward markets in an effort to increase liquidity. So in theory, greater liquidity should lead the rates to converge.
Now, Jill, would it really make any sense if the CBN would allow the naira to trade freely?
Well, it all comes down to a shortage of dollars. So let's take a look at a real-life example provided by CNN Money to provide some context. Nigeria exports plenty of oil, but it relies on shipments from abroad to source basic household items and food. Nigerian importers need to pay these foreign companies in their home currencies, but dollars and euros are in short supply. That's because anyone with foreign currency is trying to hold on to it, and most everyone else is forced to rely on the black market. Nigeria's dollar reserves grew to a 19-month high of about 31 billion last week, thanks to a recent rise in global oil prices, the country's main source of hard currency. But reserves remain far off the peak of the 64 billion they reached in August 2008. Also, just yesterday, crude oil hit a 5-week low as the system is in a severe supply glut, and oil companies are continuing to produce at record levels.
Now, Jill, thank you very much. We'll catch up with you on Friday.
Okay, thank you.
That is Jill Malandrino, Africa 54 business correspondent, reporting from New York. Now, women in Africa are uniquely adept at entrepreneurship. According to the 2015 Gates Clinton Foundation research, 41% of women in Nigeria and Zambia are entrepreneurs, compared to 10% in the United States and 5% in Britain. Africa's women also represent 70% of the informal economy, and together with the youth population make up the fastest growing and largest market demographic in the world. However, many women-led enterprises are not enjoying significant growth. And joining me in the studio to discuss the challenges women entrepreneurs in Africa are facing in raising capital is Ngozi Bell, an entrepreneur and advocate for small business. Ngozi, you're very welcome to Africa 54. Now, let's start there and tell me, what are the key challenges that women entrepreneurs in Africa are facing in being able to raise capital?
So one of the first things is training. Okay, so a lot of women entrepreneurs are not getting the same access to training that their male counterparts get with respect to raising capital. The other thing is access to networks. You won't believe, even as chatty as women are and as interesting as they are, they don't have the same type of ecosystems that afford them access to people who have capital, whether they're venture capitalists, whether they're private equity investors, or even angel investors. So women are left out of this melee of opportunity where they can get access to capital. So a lot of women tend to rely on microfinancing type of opportunities or peer-to-peer lending, which allows for relationship. But what is interesting is that statistics have shown worldwide that women actually make 12% more revenue, better revenue when they're in charge than men. I know it sounds controversial because you say, is it because they're women? But it's because of some unique ability and innate ability to manage businesses, manage relationships extremely effectively.
So what I hear from you is that there's a lack of policy that is geared towards equal pay for women and equal education opportunities, especially for small businesses. So what needs to be done here in Africa to help those women?
That's a very good question. So with respect to policy, we have to have more women being part of the policy decisions. You know, it's easy. Let's say you're the person who is in charge of finances and you're a man. You're going to think from the perspective of men because that's the characteristics you've always seen. But women uniquely are homemakers. They're more likely to invest back into the family and into the home and into their community. So if we make policies that allow those things be part of the consideration of how capital is raised, then women are more likely to get money. So it's making sure that women are part of the policy making, making sure women are also making part of that policy. The other thing with respect to equal pay, you're absolutely right. 66 million women are poor, even in this nation that we sit in. 66 million women. In our continent, 50% of the population are women, and many of them, a high number of them, I think it's about 80%, live under the poverty line.
So the other question, Ngozi, that comes to mind is how important is networking, you know, for African women who are doing businesses, whether they are small businesses like hair salons and stuff like that, when you think about, you know, networking within their own countries and even within the continent of Africa in order to thrive?
Extremely important, extremely important. You know, we talk about how men go to the golf course and make a deal. Women have to do the same thing. But the thing, though, that is beautiful is that because of the way organizations and corporations are set up today, women don't have a lot of role models. So women have to become their own role models. And I'll tell you an example. One of the things that we're seeing is peer networking, peer-to-peer networking, where groups of women from different walks of life can come together and help each other. So if I'm in the healthcare industry, you're in the pharmaceutical industry, another person is in a small business, maybe they're more with respect to buying and selling, we can gain something from each other. You know, if I bring you into my network, you're suddenly part of maybe 100 curated people that I've already vetted that you can gain access to. So networking becomes extremely important.
And in that regard, Ngozi, how about using the social media that is now, you know, all over?
Absolutely, absolutely. That's
How key would that be?
That's extremely important. So you look at many people now with the WhatsApp. You know, many women have their high school WhatsApp. In there are people who are business owners. In there are people who are potential investors. Tapping into those relationships and calling those people out to be able to help. The other thing I want to say, Esther, is that women also have to become the investors. You know, one of the phenomena we're seeing around the world, not just in Africa, is that when women are investors, they tend to invest in other women because they understand, one, the capacity and capability of women. They also understand the functionality of how women work and how women lead. The other thing I would say to our men who are investors is invest in women businesses because you're more likely to get a 12% raise in the success of that business. So those are some of the things that I think that ought to happen to bring more success.
We'll talk to you more, Jill. Thank you so much. Hopefully, you know, women get the cue from you. You are an entrepreneur. Ngozi, thank you very much for your insight. Ngozi Bell is an entrepreneur and advocate for small businesses. Now it's time now for a short break. Still to come on Africa 54. A sportswear giant taps into a growing market. We'll be right back.
Of RSOI, but we're all going up north in very
Now, welcome back to Africa 54. Here's what's trending. Sportswear multinational Nike is launching a sports hijab for women. Nike is not the first to produce such a garment, but the entrance of a big brand into modest sportswear is being hailed for the potential to bring more Muslim women into sport. Some Islamic conservatives say women should not be playing sport at all. Many Muslims argue that ultimately bans on religious headgear simply prevent women from playing sport. They say this results in Muslim women being excluded from normal community activities and a shortage of visible Muslim women who could inspire others. Next up, move over slot machines. Casinos in Las Vegas are now adding skill-based video games to traditional games of chance. It's all part of an effort to attract more millennials. Video game gambling machines are also on the floors of casinos in Atlantic City, New Jersey, and more locations will be rolled out later this year. But the games may not only appeal to the young, old-school arcade fans who fed countless quarters into the video games may finally get to win some of that money back. And finally, high drama at the traditional May Day cheese rolling world championships into the British town of Stilton. The teams are made up of 4 competitors, each of whom must roll a special wooden cheese along a road. Many competitors wore elaborate outfits and masks. No one is quite sure when the competition first began. The Stilton race is not linked to another traditional cheese rolling race event, which takes place on Cooper's Hill in Gloucestershire and sees scores of competitors race downhill in pursuit of a slab of cheese. The competition is due to take place later in May. And that's what's trending today. And that's our show for today. Be sure to watch Africa 54 on our website at voaafrica.com. For more news, tune into VOA's evening radio show, Africa News Tonight at 1800 UTC, and in the mornings to Daybreak Africa between 0300 and 0600 UTC Monday through Friday. Thanks for watching and a very good night from Washington.
Welcome to English in a Minute. Most people enjoy listening to music. But is this expression actually about songs and tunes?
Music to my ears.
Jonathan, I cannot believe we have to work over the weekend.
Did you not hear the news? The meeting for the project got canceled. No work this weekend after all.
Awesome! That is music to